So I'm excited to kick us off talking about inclusive communication strategies. Just to introduce myself a bit, my name is Faith Kellermeyer. I'm a self-described word nerd, and I have a bachelor's in counseling psychology and a master's degree in organizational communication. And I'm really fascinated by the way that we use language and communication to build communities and to support one another. In addition to my education, I also have 8 years of experience managing and creating social media content, mainly for higher education and community organizations. But I've also managed communication strategy for arts programming and for an artist collective that I co founded in Indiana before I moved to Philadelphia. And for the past 3 years, I've been the social media and digital marketing coordinator for Drexel's College of Computing and Informatics. The types of organizations that I've worked with have a lot of differences in their cultures and approaches to different issues. So today I'll be sharing some strategies that I've picked up from my various experiences, but mostly I'm here to foster a discussion. These issues of inclusive communication and anti-racism cannot be solved with quick, easy tips, and there's no one size fits all approach. These are really difficult issues that we need to grapple with. So my hope is that today during my presentation, the wisdom that we gained from Brandyn, and also during the Q&A session that, we plant a seed and get you thinking about things in the days and weeks to come for how you can be a more active accomplice in making your community more inclusive and use your sphere of influence to make a difference. So I'll try to keep things fairly brief today. I'll start off by talking about how language is fluid and why it's important to maintain a learning mindset. Again, I said I'm a word nerd and I'm really into this stuff. Second, I'll move into talking about crafting public messaging. So I'll go over when and how to use social media platforms to respond to social change and movements. Third, I'll talk about responding to feedback. So, when your messaging doesn't come across maybe the way you intended, how to handle criticism from your stakeholders. And I'll talk a little bit about communication theory in that section. And then finally, I'll wrap up by giving, on the flip side, my advice for delivering thoughtful critique when you see a brand or organization mishandling their social media communication strategies. So let's get into it. I'll start off by talking about how language is fluid. In a lot of aspects of our lives, we totally expect change to take place, right? We're not really surprised when it's time to update our iPhone, and we don't insist that an operating system is the right one to use forever just because it's what we were taught in college. But for some reason, humans struggle to accept that our language is just as fluid and dynamic as our technology. And one of our culture's biggest obstacles that we need to overcome is the idea that our language doesn't matter as much as other more tangible forms of freedom and oppression do, right? And in part, I think that's because we create and co-produce language all the time, every day, a lot of times without really thinking about it. But our language matters. This quote from Lal Zimin, who is a sociolinguistic researcher, I think sums it up pretty nicely. Getting people to understand that language itself is a means through which people can be harmed, elevated, or valued is really important. Terminology that was acceptable in the past, especially when it comes to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, will change, right? Because our language changes. We saw over the summer when the Associated Press made the decision to change their style guide to start capitalizing the B in Black. And over the past several years, we've also seen our style books grapple with how and when to use the singular they. And it's okay if you encounter terminology that at first is confusing or hard to understand. Another sociolinguist, Amanda Montell, writes that the language we use to define ourselves evolves. This is interesting and important, but for some, it can be hard to keep up, which can make an otherwise well-meaning person confused and defensive. So my sincere hope is that everyone in this presentation today has a long enough life and a long enough career that at some point you're confronted with language that is confusing or that's different than what you were taught. But also that we maintain a flexible mindset with a willingness to learn. We can't control the way that culture changes around us, but we can control how we react to it. So if you sincerely want to create a culture of diversity in your organization, you need to always be learning and observing the shifts in how we use language to keep up with social change. And I also think it's important, when someone takes the time out of their day to correct you, try to view that as a learning experience as much as you can rather than an occasion to become offended, right? Um, and in part, I bring this all to your attention to remind you that, language is a critical tool, which in part is why it's important to hire good communication strategists whose job it is to stay on top of these linguistic trends. But also because without language, there is no social media. And we've seen that social media can be used to help an organization respond to ongoing social changes. But social media use during a crisis can also add fuel to the flames and tarnish your organization's reputation if it's not handled appropriately. Um, which kind of brings me to the next point in my discussion, when and how to use social media platforms to respond to social change and movements. So, if you weren't paying attention before 2020, I hope it's clear now that social media is a very powerful tool. Social media is often the first place that someone's going to encounter your brand and form an opinion of you. And I'm also sure that you've noticed over the past year, the importance of welding it responsibly to respond to social movements and national tragedies. The way that your brand copes with crafting those statements will have an impact on the way people perceive and choose whether or not to trust your brand. There's no quick, easy strategy here for crafting a statement because a lot of these issues and movements and events are difficult things that our society hasn't figured out how to grapple with. But generally, I've seen brands fall into one of two camps, right? So we either see a very swift response, one that comes quickly and is timely, but sometimes those are lacking in reflection or action steps. And we also frequently see no response at all, brands that continue on with business as usual. And at a certain point, a very delayed response, if you take, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks to put out any sort of statement, that can have the same impact as no response at all. In both cases, we can do better. Brands and organizations in that latter camp tend to be less agile. A lot of times they have many layers of people who have to approve a statement and sign off, reviewing whether they're saying the right thing to the point of inaction. So I think it's clear why that's problematic. And in general, I think it's always better to say something than nothing to show that you care about members of your community. But there are two things that you should really take into consideration before you even get to the point of posting or publishing any statement on social media. So, first of all, behind the scenes, what are you doing or what could you be doing to address this issue? And when I ask that, I mean real, tangible steps that your brand can take to work on it beyond posting to a public platform. And that's not an easy question because it requires an ongoing commitment. If you're not taking steps to diversify your board members, to upskill and sponsor the careers of your diverse employees, to make sure that your supply chain is buying from Black owned businesses, or even, donating part of your profit to different social justice causes, then why are you posting on social media? Are you really committed to diversity in ways that you have the power to impact? Or is it more of a PR calculation? And again, that's a difficult question, but part of why I ask it is also because your audience is going to be able to tell if you're actually just paying lip service or if you truly are supported to these causes in tangible ways. So that's the first thing you need to consider. The second, what is the potential impact of your social media post? And I'm talking about beyond just the content that you put into it. You need to give some thought to the hashtags that you're using. Consider what you might be potentially covering up. Are you maybe clogging up a hashtag that's being used by activists and organizers? And it's also important to think about whether your post provides any educational resources or directs people into ways that they can act, because if not, it may be performative, right? And I think case studies are helpful for illustrating these things where we can see real life examples. And a good example of that you may remember is Blackout Tuesday. So over the summer, seemingly overnight, a lot of our social media feeds, especially on Instagram, they started being filled up with all of these Black squares, right? And many of these posts use the Black Lives Matter hashtag in their caption. The origins of this viral trend are hard to pin down, but I believe overall the intent was good, right? People wanted to show their support for Black Lives Matter, especially in light of the protests that were taking place this summer over the killing of George Floyd. But if you look at the impact, we can see a slightly different story. 24 hours prior to this trend going viral, if you clicked on that Black Lives Matter hashtag, you were able to find a wealth of information and educational resources from social activists. And more importantly, I think practical information about logistics and safety protocol for people who were taking part in protests. But overnight, all of that information was covered up by people who really meant to do the right thing by posting these black squares, but didn't think through what that did to the utility of that hashtag that had been used by activists for years prior, right? Our impact is greater than our intent. And that's why it's important as individuals, but also as organizations to critically analyze the origins of these viral trends before jumping on board. To frame it a bit differently, the impact and the public perception of your organization matter more than your brand's level of responsibility when you come under fire for mishandling your public messaging. So, the perception becomes the reality that you need to deal with. Um, and that kind of brings me to the third point, which is how to respond to negative feedback from your stakeholders. Hopefully before you got to the point of posting anything on social media, you thought through your messaging. You've got great strategic communications employees who help make sure that your language is up to date. And ideally, you also have buy-in from your leadership for how you plan to address these issues offline. But even with all of those elements in play, you can still make a mistake, especially true if you're a homogenous organization that doesn't have a lot of people from diverse backgrounds able to be part of those decision-making processes, right? So, your message might be taken in a different way than you intended, but it's important to remember that your impact is greater than your intent. And you owe it to your clients, stakeholders, and your employees to address it when these things become public gaffes. So, how to handle it? We can look to crisis communication scholars for some advice. So, in the next few slides, I'm going to be referring to situational crisis communication theory, SCCT for short, which gives us a framework for matching appropriate crisis response strategies with different types of crises. And in addition to assessing all the different strategies that can be taken, there are a few influencing variables that should impact your selection of the appropriate strategy. And those are the severity of damage, right? It's if people are being physically harmed, it's clearly more of a crisis if that's the situation. Attribution of control, which, as I said before, the perception of whether your brand could have done something differently is an important thing to consider. And also performance history. How has your brand handled these situations in the past? And I bring that one to attention, especially because I think when we get to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing that they don't do anything at all. They're worried that it's going to blow up. But if your organization or if you as an individual have a history of sincerely, trying to do the right thing, listening when people give you feedback, it's not likely to turn into a huge PR crisis. When that happens, if your organization has a pattern of not listening to their audience and not doing the right thing, something that is seemingly innocuous can turn into a bigger crisis. So that performance history is important. So I've created this graphic to hopefully make it a little simpler to understand. SCCT provides us with this spectrum of responses that an organization can take and select and respond to whatever crisis they're dealing with. And that spectrum ranges from most offensive, where your priority is protecting the brand reputation and the company, to most accommodative, where your priority is actually taking care of the people who were harmed by your action. Now, there are some instances where these more defensive strategies are perfectly appropriate. If someone's spreading misinformation about your brand, or perhaps there was a manufacturing error beyond your control, it can make sense to select one of these strategies. But frequently when we're talking about social media and mishandling of messaging, we're not talking about faulty products that may have been misused by a consumer. We're actually looking at the potential for your business to be viewed as uncaring, thoughtless, and racist. And if that's the situation, only the most accommodative strategies are appropriate. So the two most accommodative strategies that you can take are corrective action. So that requires you to make a plan to do better. And it's also important to be really transparent about how you will measure your efficacy so that the public can hold you accountable. Additionally, you can make a full apology, and that requires you to take responsibility and ownership. And so often I see brands putting out statements where they don't actually say the word sorry or apologize. And that is not the right way to go about it, right? People can see through those very carefully crafted PR statements where people dance around actually taking any ownership. Um, but if you sincerely value your audience's opinions of you, you need to trust them and listen when they point out that you need to apologize. Um, Especially when it comes to instances of racism, the literature suggests that the corrective action would involve stating your intolerance of racism, and to me, what's most important, presenting your next steps and action plan for fixing the problem so that it doesn't happen again. Now, I think it's helpful to illustrate what can go wrong when you don't follow this guidance. So I have another case study to share with you. Um, like I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, I'm from the Midwest, so this story really caught my attention. Earlier this year, the Indianapolis Museum of Art published a job posting where they were looking for a new director. Now, part of the job posting had language about wanting to increase their diversity programming, but they also included some problematic language about wanting someone who would maintain their core white art audience. That's problematic for a number of reasons. And I also want to note that part of the problem here, beyond just the language that they selected, was that performance history piece that I mentioned earlier. This isn't the first time that this specific museum took an action that was considered harmful to their surrounding community and excluded people of color. So people were rightfully so outraged when this took place. And in response to that outrage, the museum posted a statement on Instagram. I've got a screenshot of it here. And first, I'll read through it with you and then dissect it to show exactly how they missed the mark here. So the statement that they posted read, "Our audience, and most museums' audiences, have historically been and currently are too homogenous, and we are committed to changing that and intentionally diversifying our audiences. We deeply regret that in our job description, in our attempt to focus on building and diversifying our core audience, our wording was divisive rather than inclusive. Our intention is to continue to build an institution that is truly inclusive, and it will be our challenge for years to come to continue building our diversity, equity, and inclusion in our hiring, programs, artwork, exhibitions, and more, and we are committed to doing so." So at face value, there's nothing explicitly outrageous about that statement, but like I mentioned before, the most appropriate strategy are those that are most accommodative. So corrective action and issuing a full apology. And in this next slide, I'll break down a bit where they, didn't exactly do that. So right off the bat, they point out that most museums' audiences have the same problem. Now that may be true, but this apology that they should have issued is about a specific instance at their museum that they had control over. So by deflecting and pointing out that lots of other museums have the same problem, it's really not taking ownership. Second, here they say we deeply regret, but if you look through the whole post, there's nowhere that they actually use the words apology, apologize, sorry, and deeply regret doesn't really take any ownership. Actually, the language that they're using is pretty passive. They're talking about the job description and the wording that they use, but nowhere do they talk about the leadership decisions that were made that led them to getting to the point of thinking that it was okay to post the job description as is. As we keep going, they talk about their intent, right? But nowhere in this statement do they acknowledge the impact. They don't talk about how their actions hurt their community members or betrayed the trust of the audience that had supported them, donated them, gone to their programming in the past years. And then this last sentence, while yes, it does say that they're building diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of these different aspects of their business, there's no real actionable plan, right? Especially in this part where they talk about doing it for years to come. What does that mean? Saying you're committed to building diversity is very different than putting forward a transparent plan. And this gave the public no way to hold them accountable to make sure they were actually doing what they said they would, right? Um, and in part, what was so upsetting about this, and actually, let me back up a second. Rightfully so, the public was not satisfied with this response, and there ended up being more backlash, and their current director ended up stepping down. Um, and again, I think part of this backlash is because we expect more from museums, universities, and other nonprofits because we put trust in them to manage really important issues in our society. So when this type of organization mishandles diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, it really stings and makes us angry. And we're likely to send angry comments on social media, which brings me to my final point. my advice for delivering thoughtful critique when you see something like this taking place online. So, while it may feel cathartic to publicly denounce an organization for their misdeeds and put them on blast on social media, that's not always the best first way to achieve change and progress. And I want to add a little caveat to say it's worth considering the person running an organization's social media will bear the brunt of public reaction, but more often than not, they are not responsible for a lot of the leadership decisions that are taking place behind the scenes. And it's possible if you're only sharing your reactions on social media, that message may never reach someone who has actual leadership power within the organization. So if you're able to find contact information for someone in leadership, a more direct and strategic way to make change and make sure that you're heard is to contact them directly. And I recommend crafting a message with three key elements. So, first, it's important to point out exactly what the organization did wrong. Describe to them specifically how they've harmed their reputation and what you saw. Second, tell them how it made you feel as a client or a stakeholder. You can describe your sincere reaction. Does it make you less likely to work with them in the future? It's important to let them know because they should care what their audience and customer base thinks. And third, point out what they can do to fix the problem. If you have any ideas, offer solutions to them. Think about what would make you comfortable trusting them again. And as a customer, what would return your faith in that organization? It's reasonable to make this direct strategy your first attempt because at the end of the day, organizations are run by people and people make mistakes. If you reach out in this way, it gives them a chance to fix the problem without putting them on blast and gives them an opportunity to make things right. Whereas if we go directly to social media, the organization may become defensive and not want to fix the problem. I also think it's important to say if you attempt this strategy and you don't receive a thoughtful response, at that point, social media may be a good tool for getting their attention. Organizations, especially those with great social power, are not immune from any public critique when they refuse to own up to their misdeeds. But I do think that this first strategy can be, again, a bit more direct and a little more compassionate. So I covered a lot of ground in a little bit of time. So on this last slide here, I have listed my references. I'm more than happy to share this slide deck if anyone is interested in checking out the articles or books that I referred to. And also, I would love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn. And as I said at the beginning, I really want this to be a jumping off point for a discussion. So definitely feel free to reach out to me.
Fantastic. And I'm going to be following up on some of Faith's points, going into some new ones. So I will dive in and one moment here. Okay. I'm just going to present right from Canva. So we are, as Faith mentioned so well, there are so many aspects of this to cover and consider. A lot of this gets back to basics. I hope you're getting the point that there is an important symbiotic relationship between your external communications and your internal culture. What you're communicating on the outside, if there are problems inside. So while we think we are giving you a lot of great food to thought, people want a checklist or a recipe for it. How do I do inclusive communications? And one of the things I want to be sure you understand is that there's no one size fits all solution or situation. And so much of it really requires ongoing learning in diversity, equity, and inclusion work and in terms of anti-racism, as Faith mentioned. I also think it's really important to get back to some of the basics about our marketing and our brand for business owners. a question. So I didn't introduce myself. I will do that. I was so excited to jump right in. I am Brandyn Campbell. I have a company called Brandyn Campbell Communications, where I do consulting that helps businesses helps businesses build and articulate their commitment to racial equity. We do that through inclusive communications, content audits, as well as full-on strategy, evaluation, and implementation of how to achieve more inclusive environments. And my background is in content creation and content strategy. And this was one of my favorite questions to ask folks when I was doing more content strategy work. How do you want people to feel when they interact with your business? And that's really important when you think about your branding overall. And when you're thinking about the issue of being inclusive in your content, I ask it because it's also important. I would assume the answer is you don't want them to feel left out. You want them to feel heard and cared for. So that's a really important factor in thinking through your inclusive communication strategies and your overall content strategy for your business. How do you want members of your audience to feel? Another important question to ask is, what are your audience's concerns and values? What are, as we saw in as we all saw this summer, a lot of people were vocal in letting brands know what wasn't done correctly in their Black Lives Matter statements. And that's important for brands to listen to, not just in their response to that particular moment, but because it is telling you where your audience is, what sort of values matter to them. And this fits in with the last question in terms of how do you want them to feel when they come to your content? You don't want them to feel like their concerns are devalued or ignored. So that's a really important question to ask yourself when you're sitting thinking about, okay, what are going to be our next steps? It all matters simply from I believe, a human rights perspective, but there is what I call the business case for diversity. Even if it's something you don't care about. And I know that's not true because you wouldn't have come to this presentation if that's the case. But there certainly is, as I'm sure you've seen, there's some pushback in some organizations in terms of having to do all of this and, oh, it's political, we don't want to do that. We are in a really interesting time right now where we're changing in so many ways. One of those ways is by radical being what's now the norm. I use that term because last year at this time, if you asked Americans what they thought about the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm going to guess less than a majority would have said that they supported it. Obviously, things really changed last year, and Pew in September found that 55% of American adults support Black Lives Matter. That percentage is actually down from June when they did a survey, and that amount was at 67% when issues of racial justice and the murder of George Floyd were right there and couldn't be ignored. So something that issuing a Black Lives Matter statement last April is something most companies wouldn't have done. And almost all did it in June. So we can see there how that there's a change. There's also a really big shift in demographics. Gen Z is, I should say, in 4 years, they are expected to be 40% of the world's consumers. It's the most diverse generation in American history, 48% of Gen Z. So folks born in 1995 are BIPOC. That stands for Black, Indigenous, People of Color. And they are concerned about environmental issues. They've grown up seeing climate change as they are largely, or I shouldn't say largely, but almost half are people of colors themselves. They want to hear and companies talk about issues relating to social justice and racial justice. And really importantly, they were asked who they believe is going to be change more effective they were asked specifically about environmental issues, and they believe that brands are the key. It's going to be companies that are going to find the solutions and be the more effective change agents. So they really are combining their values with their purchasing power. So that's a really important trend to take note of. And it really isn't a trend, it's how the demographics of our society are shifting. And if you think about building the internal culture of your business, the future in terms of folks who are looking for inclusive environments, we know that millennials are very driven by issues of culture and cultures that value diversity. And it is the same from what we're seeing from Gen Z. They're starting to enter the workforce. So from a business perspective, just thinking about your future talent attraction and retaining, if you're not thinking about these issues and how they'll play out within your company and how you'll talk about them, you're going to lose out on talent in addition to customers. So if businesses aren't really thinking about these issues substantively, then very soon they are going to be behind, and the companies that have been able to be conversant in this language will move ahead. I love this quote from Austin Channing Brown. The work of anti-racism is the work of becoming a better human to other humans, because it really simply, beautifully states what's at stake when we're talking about choices and what we stand for. If you want to take an anti-racist approach, it's what most of us probably do in the beginning of most days. We reflect on the day before. There are things we want to do better. We want to be better people. It's at the core what most people want to do. And this is really what this work is. And when you think of your content, it's so critical because you're telling stories. So whose voices are you centering? Whose voices are being amplified? It is very possible, and it's in fact critical in your communications to be anti-racist in your approach as well. I mentioned that we're going to go back to basics in some ways, and another real key element in thinking about your communication strategy and building an inclusive plan is being really clear on your core values. If you think on this past year, some have called it a racial reckoning. You can see people's heads spinning. They want to do something, they want to say something, they're not sure. And I really think that's because so much is stuck in their heads. They kind of know what they believe. I know this is wrong, but I don't know what to say. So being clear on what you believe in and what you stand for is a really great and important way to draw your line in the sand. Don't think about, I'd encourage, if you're a business owner, if you are in a business and influence the decision making and don't have clearly stated core values or want to refine them, I'd say for about 15 minutes, don't think of how polished they are, what edits you want to make, just write out what your beliefs are. I believe that all lives, that all humans are valuable and should be treated equally. Just write out whatever comes to mind, and then you can go back to that and then craft your value statements. And think about, what do I believe just as a person? And for small business owners, there's such strong alignment between your personal and the business. And even in business, what does this business stand for? And it can be helpful to figure out what you believe personally in making that step to figuring out what you want your business to value. And that's really important in thinking about the sorts of issues you want to comment on moving forward. There is a lot of fear in the issue of being inclusive in your content. I offer a course on the topic for business owners, and I wanted them to just get out. What are you afraid of? And Faith mentioned that it's important to say something, and if you're not sure what you should do, it's important. You should probably err on the side of saying something. There's so many fears in doing that, and acknowledging what those are can also be helpful in this process. There's a learning orientation throughout is critical, and we've spoken about that. And part of that is going to be unlearning. So unlearning some terminology. Many of us were taught that, oh, it's not okay to talk about politics. Well, why is that? And is talking about the value of a human life, is that political? I would argue that it's not. That's something we have to unlearn. Staying quiet about what we believe and what's right and wrong really helps to support systems of oppression. So we're afraid, we've been taught all of our lives, don't talk out about politics. We're terrified to say the wrong thing. We don't want it to be a microaggression. Terminology changes. You're scared to offend someone. Does any of this sound familiar for the folks who are listening? You're scared of we've heard about this so much in the past several weeks, scared of being called out or canceled. Is that something that you're fearful of? And lastly, a lot of folks who have done a good amount of work are scared of being called performative. They want to say something, they believe they have something to say, but how do you determine whether it's the right thing or if people will believe your actions? And it's important to name what your fears are. You can do your best then to try to address them and acknowledge them. And we'll talk a little bit about what to do from there. So I wanted to define, we often talk about and throw around the terms performative allyship. I really like this definition from a writer for Elle Australia. And she says the practice of words, posts, and gestures that do more to promote an individual's own virtuous moral compass than actually helping the causes that they're intending to showcase. In some scenarios, performative allyship can also directly hinder actual activists who are on the ground and doing the sustained continual work, which is exactly what we saw with the Black Square, Black Lives Matter hashtag instance. So this is people's fear that, if I talk about an issue and maybe it's not something I've talked about before, will people believe it? Will they think that I'm just trying to do it for show because it's what everyone else is doing? I think that the best way not to avoid that is to really be authentic. And a great way to be authentic is to work on just throughout your life being an ally, an accomplice. There are many terms for it, but it's a lifelong process of building relationships based on trust, consistency, and accountability with marginalized individuals and or groups of people. It's not self-defined. You can't say I'm an ally. It's something you work towards. The work and efforts must be recognized by those who you're seeking to ally with. So thinking about this in terms of your content can be really helpful. How am I raising people's voices? Am I trying to partner with or advocate for, or am I trying to center myself? And if you are in the practice of working to be an ally throughout your life, this is something that really directly applies to how an organization can communicate about difficult issues. I mentioned that there's no checklist. It is a really hard issue, and there's so many variables, but some general guidelines that can be helpful as you think about specific posts and creating a strategy overall that's inclusive. As I said, be authentic, be clear on your values, and speak to those. If something happens that is not in alignment with your values, that's something to speak out on. And that is something, if you have a history of doing that, the performance history, then that's something that people will begin to understand and learn and know. Really think about, as often as you can, and this is both in your communications in terms of content and within the organization, amplify marginalized voices. This is why when you talk about diversity and inclusion in workplaces, the inclusion piece is so important, because if you have diversity and you have, bodies and seats who are different colors, it's great, but are they in leadership positions where they can speak on what's happening and really amplify their voices that way? So are you trying to provide space to someone else, or are you taking up that space? And it's really important to diversify the content you consume. Who do you follow on social media? Who are some of the media sources that you read in your personal time? Because a lot of it, frankly, is not very diverse. And if you're always hearing just one side of the story, you won't even think of, oh gosh, this is happening. This is something I should speak to. You may not even be aware that it's happening. So at the end of the presentation, I have some suggestions for media outlets to follow, but they're ones like The Root and The Griot that are really good and will provide some diversity to the stories that you are consuming yourself. So I really want to be sure we get to questions. I'm not going to speak too much on this. Faith did a really nice job with case studies. I wanted to highlight just some brands that I think are doing some interesting things on social media and with the way that they are telling stories, including people speaking out on social justice. Here's a range and some that I'd encourage you to look into and to get some ideas perhaps for yourself moving forward. And I will, similar to Faith, if you are interested in a copy of the slides, I'm happy to provide those, and I'll give my contact information at the end of the presentation. So as I was saying, a question to really ask yourself, get in the habit of doing this, both for your content at your workplace, in meetings. Whose voice is being centered, who's taking up space, and who needs to take a step back and hand the microphone to someone else. Even thinking of that visual may be helpful in really trying to achieve the work that you want to achieve. And again, you don't want any members of your audience to feel left out. So be sure that you have a good sense of who your audience is, who they are, what they look like, and what they value. So some key takeaways. Again, it's not a checklist, but it's something that I think can really help to guide you and help be a check as you're creating posts moving forward and creating your strategy. There are a lot of different ways to be inclusive in your content, which you'll see from that sample list I shared with you. It's in the images you use, the language you use, which we've focused on because the language is so important in what you're framing and sharing, as well as the topics you're talking about. So there are many ways to be inclusive. One quick note I want to say, a lot of people, and you'll see in stock photography, there's the one photo that has, male, female, someone of every race. It's perfectly inclusive in one photo, and it usually is pretty transparent and cheesy. Don't put that pressure on yourself for, one perfect photo, one perfect post. It's really the totality of what you're doing. Again, that performance history. People can see, it's not, you don't have to not post white people. That's not what we're saying at all. People can see, though, if you are showing people who look differently, who identify differently. So think of it that way, and hopefully that helps to lessen some of the pressure. There's no formula, so just learn from your audience and grow your awareness. And as we heard and as we saw with the case study with the museum in Indianapolis, if mistakes happen, learn from them, apologize, and fail forward, meaning no one likes to make mistakes, but this work is really messy. And if they happen, if you truly can learn from it, then that's an invaluable lesson, and really take that with you as you continue to try to do better. So here are some resources that I really like on this topic. There's something called the Conscious Style Guide that has really great articles helping you to think about language and what you're saying and how you frame things. The AP now has a style guide for race-related coverage that can be really helpful. A lot of people get stuck on I don't know what to call this group. The capitalization of Black is from the style guide. The Content Marketing Institute has a really good article as well on how to do diverse and inclusive content, marketing that matters. So I recommend checking that out. And as I mentioned, some of the real good media outlets to check out, I mentioned The Root and The Grio, Al Dia, Latina Magazine. There's something called As Am News. HuffPost has a couple of different channels. They have Asian voices, Black voices, as does NBC. So it's easy to just kind of follow along. And it's also interesting to compare some of the articles that make it, MSNBC is a huge platform, but, it's interesting to look at what makes it onto NBC Asian American versus, regular NBC. So thank you so much. Can't wait to dive in. Here is my information. I know that this is a lot, and we're excited to get you thinking and talking. I'm going to stop sharing now, and hopefully we can have a nice conversation.
Thank you so much, Faith and Brandon. Those were really great presentations.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So I guess my first question, it's kind of a tricky one. Brandon, you mentioned the importance of amplifying marginalized voices and providing space to the people who need to be speaking. But I find that sometimes there's an interesting line between that and like tokenism and kind of putting someone on the spot to talk about something they're not comfortable talking about. And how do you kind of tread that line?
That's a great one. I'll attempt to answer it. And Faith, if you have a different or additional perspective, please dive in as well. So much of this is hard because it's dependent on, I'll use the word listening, but it's listening really in all ways, listening to someone's body language. Tokenizing, you absolutely don't want to do, kind of saying, oh, when we know that, like, oh, here's one person and this is what they said. So, but what I think what's a good way to proceed or to think about when something happens. So let's, as an example, use the horrifying shootings in Atlanta that targeted Asian women. Many people won't want to talk about it publicly, aren't ready. There's so much pain to process. But there are many people who were speaking about it and who were saying how it impacted them, how they felt about it, who were sharing resources. So it's if there's a voice you want to amplify, you want to say something, but you don't want to center yourself, look for the voices who are speaking and who want to be heard and who are speaking as part of their grieving and healing. And those are the voices. And you'll notice when there are people speaking out on events that happen, folks will ask in the comments, is it okay if I share this? And go ahead and do that. And if they are okay with it, generally, if it's posted and it's a public account, generally people are okay. But it is important to ask on such important and sensitive topics. And that's when I think you are making the difference between, you're not tokenizing, you're lifting a voice who can speak about with authority on the subject matter, and you're letting people know that this is something they should be paying attention to.
Okay,
Thank you.
Totally agree with all that. I also just want to throw in, like I said, a lot of my work is in higher ed, but I found that a lot of colleges do this poorly, where you see a college that is mostly white and their brochures have the most people of color on them. So you want, as you're putting together that content, it's really important to think about whether you are doing it, I guess, performatively, or if you're actually making structural changes so that more students from diverse backgrounds feel comfortable applying and staying at your college, because that's another problem, again, sort of specific to higher ed, but I think the lessons apply to other organizations. And I think what Brandon talked about, if you are really nailing down your values, and if you value amplifying diverse voices, I think that's going to be more genuine. And I know that's not a very simple answer, but the more genuine you are in wanting to just hear what people have to say, rather than putting, 3 kids of color on your brochure to make sure that you check the diversity box, I think you'll approach it differently.
If I can add on to that, I completely agree. and you see it so much, or in companies, we have the one diverse hire and they're in every picture. That's not the way to do it. That's not being authentic. It's not who you are. And it's great to be building to get to that place. And when we talk about, having diversity and being inclusive, that doesn't mean you have to have images that aren't representative of who you are and what you are. So that is a really fine line to walk, but I'm really glad you brought that up, because yes, that is something, and you can tell when that's the case. It's just so perfectly staged.
I was curious, Brandyn, in your comments, I've certainly been in many situations where I feel like certain voices are being like louder than others, and not knowing how to shut them up, so that everybody or more people at the table have an opportunity to speak. And if you have any suggestions on deflecting, or how to do that in a way that gets more voices heard, because I completely agreed with that statement and felt like I struggle to do that appropriately.
Sure, and that is hard, because we've all encountered, probably know, the people who just take up lots of space and they are really comfortable with it and they are not self-aware, and if they are, they're just are unbothered. So some good ways or some strategies are to, I think, when you're making comments yourself, let's say, to say, just to show that you're being mindful, I don't want to take up too much space. And that can be it's subtle, but can be a way to say, let's be mindful of this. A great way to amplify this is more of a work setting, but it can be at presentations, any sort of venue like this, even if someone, let's say it's a panel and it's largely men and there's one woman and she's being talked over. You can, someone on the panel can say, you know what, Tracy had a really great thing that she said, and I want to come back to that. You can force the room to pay attention to that person. And Tracy, could you say again what you said? Because I thought it was so important. And to really, if people aren't willing to give space, to find those ways to angle it and to get people heard that way. And those examples, there are ways to do that in your writing and comments as well. And it can be really, really helpful in settings like this as well.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion.
I'm glad.
I actually have a question. And also thank you so much for your presentations. I really enjoyed them. I guess so from my background, I'm currently a student and I'm a part of an Asian association on my campus. And one of the things, and with the recent, Atlanta shooting, I felt, and I think Brandyn, you mentioned this in your presentation, of making sure you use social media in like a timely manner. And I felt our org felt the, I guess, spotlight, and it was like an expectation to post. And I feel we did take our time, to make sure we said what we wanted to say. But how do you suggest to mitigate, I guess, like that pressure and just making sure you do say something when you want to, especially if you are an org, and in terms of, I guess, like a spotlight on social media? Oh, I'm sorry, I think you might be muted.
All this time and still it happens. It's a great question. I would say, to some extent, if you are an organization that represents a population that an atrocity has happened to, I think some of the rule, there's a lot more leeway, because you're experiencing the pain of this event in a way that others aren't. But I understand that if you are such an organization who also feels pressure, I should say something. I think it's perfectly appropriate to say something very short and brief and honest. We are sickened by the loss of lives. The hatred must end, and you can point to another account, point to resources, or just say a one-sentence statement that just says we are grieving along with the families in Atlanta, and we hope you will take some time to honor the victims as well. I think it's really speaking to just being honest and showing that this is painful can really help to, you don't have to have the polished, perfect statement. Having the raw emotion is I think just as, if not more effective, because it's honest.
Can I hop in too, just to add something? So I think in situations like that, the onus is on people who are outside of that marginalized group to make you feel safe. So I think, I mean, it makes sense that your group would want to respond, but also it's all the other groups on campus whose responsibility it is to make sure that you feel protected. So I hope that gives you some freedom to feel, as a group, that you can take care of yourselves and protect yourselves when you've been put in a situation where your identity is being threatened, right? I also saw, so Chanel Miller is an Asian writer and artist who put together a really beautiful post about that specific situation where, she's frequently featured in the media, and a lot of people came to her wanting her to have some kind of statement. And she made this really beautiful drawing about how she needed time to figure it out because she felt overwhelmed and felt like she was drowning in all of those feelings. And I think, there's like a self-care aspect to it too, where you need to protect yourself and your mental health by taking the time you need to figure out how to process with those emotions. And again, it's everyone else's responsibility to make you feel safe. But I do, I understand the impulse to say something. And I think Brandon's completely right. In a situation like that, something brief is perfectly fine. You don't have to have all those action steps ready to go.
Thank you so much for your responses. I really appreciate. And I think with that, we will be ending the session. I want to thank all the attendees for joining, and of course the presenters, Brandyn and Faith. And I will also direct you to our next session happening. You can send the link in the chat. And it is designed to disrupt and reimagine education, serving first generation achievement. So that is happening from 4 to 5. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks for
Thank you,
joining us,
Faith
everyone.
and Brandyn. That was amazing.